In my last two lectures, I covered the basic features of good research design. We learned how to define our concepts, how to measure our variables, and how to draw a sample. Now that we know the basics of good research design, how do we actually go about collecting and analyzing data? In my next two lectures, I'll cover quantitative and qualitative approaches to data collection and analysis. Both approaches are well respected in the social sciences, but they give us different kinds of data and they answer different kinds of questions. Let's get started with quantitative approaches to social research. Two popular quantitative methods are experiments and surveys. Experiments are used in explanatory research to pinpoint a cause and effect. In experiments, you have two groups. You've got an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group receives some kind of treatment. Let's say they go through a rehabilitation program. The control group doesn't receive the treatment. In our case, they don't go through the rehabilitation program. Your independent variable is the treatment. In our case, the rehabilitation program. And we're trying to see if the treatment group does better on some outcome in comparison to the control group. In our hypothetical case, that outcome or that dependent variable might be sobriety. We want to see if those individuals who go through the rehabilitation program have higher rates of sobriety than the individuals who don't go through the program and are therefore in the control group. To see if the treatment group does better, we need to conduct a post-test. A post-test is a measure of the dependent variable after the experimental group receives the treatment. In our experiment, we'd administer the rehabilitation program to the experimental group, and then we'd follow up with both groups in, say, a year, and see if the experimental group has higher rates of sobriety than the control group. If it does, then we can say that the treatment worked. It had a significant effect on the outcome in this case. In experiments, it's critical that individuals be randomly assigned to either the experimental or the control group. This ensures that the groups are more or less the same before the treatment, and that any observed differences between the groups after the treatment is due to the treatment and the treatment alone. Now, random assignment is achieved in much the same way as random sampling is. You just flip a coin. If it's heads, the individual gets into the experimental group. If it's tails, the individual gets into the control group. Some experimental researchers will use matching instead of random assignment. Matching isn't as good as random assignment, but it's the next best thing. In matching, we pair people up on the basis of similarity of gender, age, or some other characteristic. So the pairs, therefore, are equivalent. And one individual in the pair will receive the treatment, one individual won't, and then again, we do a follow-up test and compare how the two measure on some dependent variable. Your book also discusses quasi-experimental designs, which are experiments that don't involve random assignment. Again, quasi-experiments aren't as good as true experiments, but if you can't do a true experiment, they're the next best thing. You should be familiar with the different types of quasi-experimental designs, and you can find this information on page 139 of your book. Surveys are quite popular, and you'll see a lot of them in social research. In a survey, a sample of individuals is asked to respond to a standard set of questions. So, for example, an individual might read through a 5-page survey about their household budget. Do you or your spouse currently have a retirement account? Circle yes or no. What's your current level of credit card debt? A, less than $1,000. B, $1,000 to $5,000, or C, more than $5,000. Now, your book discusses the best way to design a survey and the best way to write survey questions. This is really an art, and it's actually much more difficult than you'd think. Obviously, you want to avoid biased questions like, don't you think our government wastes money? Other things are less obvious. For example, the book advises that you allow for uncertainty by always having a don't know response. Floaters are survey respondents who provide a response even when they don't know. So you need to give them a chance to say, I don't know, or you're going to have misleading answers. You should also have a neutral response for what we call fence sitters. Fence sitters are survey respondents that almost always see themselves as neutral on a social issue. So you need to, again, give them the option to say, I'm neutral. Often sociologists don't bother conducting the survey. Instead, they just analyze data from what we call an omnibus survey. This is a large survey that includes questions on various topics. One of the most popular omnibus surveys is the General Social Survey, which is conducted 2 times a year and covers issues from religion to politics to work. The data from the General Social Survey is made available to any social scientist who wants to analyze the data. Now, when social scientists analyze data from an omnibus survey, we say they're conducting secondary data analysis because they didn't actually collect the data. They're just analyzing data that someone else collected. The benefit of secondary data analysis is that you don't have to bother with data collection. And the data that are collected are usually collected by organizations or agencies that use the best survey techniques. Now, once you've got your quantitative data, you want to analyze it. Here you take all the information you have, you enter it typically into a statistical software program, and then you run statistical tests to see how the data are related. First, you begin with what we call descriptive statistics. These are statistics that describe your sample and their distribution across a variety of variables. How many women are in your sample? How many men? How many women versus men have less than a high school education, just a high school education, or more than a high school education, and so on. Descriptive data are typically displayed in one of 2 ways. You can have a frequency distribution, which is a table indicating the number of cases that correspond to each value of a variable. You might also see descriptive data displayed in what we call a cross-tabulation, which is a table that shows the distribution of the sample across 2 or more variables. So you might have a 2x2 table with a column for women, a column for men, and the row for voted in the last election, and another row that says didn't vote in the last election. Once you've described the data, you want to conduct what we call inferential statistics. In inferential statistics, you use statistics to estimate or predict relationships between variables. For example, you may want to predict how likely it would be for a woman with less than a high school education to vote in a presidential election. We say inferential because we don't really know. We're just using statistics to predict or estimate the likelihood that something might happen. Quantitative research is often considered more rigorous than qualitative research because the results in most cases can be generalized to a larger population, and the research has the ability to answer why or to pinpoint a cause and effect. Your book certainly upholds experiments and to some extent all quantitative methods as the benchmark of good social research. I completely disagree. In my opinion, both quantitative and qualitative research have a role to play in the social sciences. Though you can't generalize the findings from qualitative research and you can't pinpoint a cause and effect, qualitative research should not be considered less than or subpar compared to quantitative methods. As I'll suggest in my next lecture, qualitative research is designed to answer different kinds of questions that can complement the findings of quantitative research. Because they have a role to play, each of these have a role to play in the social sciences, it's best to be familiar with both quantitative and qualitative approaches to research and to respect the place of each in the various fields of social science.